Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning on into my second lecture here, which is on the book of the Walleye War, the struggle for the OGBW spearfishing and treaty rights. It's written by Larry Nesper, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's an anthropologist, and this book is actually a written account of his firsthand experiences with non-indigenous people and indigenous people conflicting in this conflict. So the conflict itself takes place in northern Wisconsin. The OGBW is made up of different tribes. There's 11, I believe, in the area, if I remember correctly from the book. And it talks about their rights and access to be able to hunt and fish on non-reservation lands. So to kind of give a little bit of background to this, in 1837 and 1842, the OGBW Chippewas signed a treaty with the United States. This is before Wisconsin is even a state at this point. And they signed this treaty, which basically cedes their land to the United States. In return, the tribes will actually have access to the lakes and the hunting off their reservation. So those are two important things to remember because this is where it really stems from. So Larry Nesper takes us on a firsthand account of his experience with people that he knows in the area, the people that he interviewed, whether it's indigenous and non-indigenous people. And he basically tells the account of this conflict that occurs between the residents that are living off reservation and the Indian people that are living on the reservation. So to kind of give a little background to this, the Walleye War, it really focuses on the Native Americans, in this case, the OGBW tribes, and their right to sovereignty, which is pretty much what they're looking to do with this treaty. They're trying to actually bring back their Indianness, if you think about it. So to give you a little background to what spearfishing is, it's actually really cool. One of the reservations, Lake do Flambeau tribe, and I'm probably butchering that a little bit, actually gets the name when it's translated into it is Lake of Fire. And the reason why it gets its name is actually it has a pretty cool history to it, is when the original fur trappers made their way out that way and they first came across the indigenous people's land, they came across this lake, and when they came across it in late April, at night there was all these boats and canoes on the water that had these flaming torches attached to it. And this is when the walleye fishing takes place, is at night. And the reason it takes place at night, and the reason why they use the light, is obviously to kind of see into the water. And the walleye actually have large eyes. And when the light shines into the water, it reflects off their large eyes and makes it very easy for the people who are spearfishing to see where the walleye are. To kind of give you an idea how successful this is, they talk about accounts in the book where they're taking literally 300 walleye at night. They talk about in some cases in the spearfishing that they're taking, in an hour, they're taking literally 10, 15, 20, and usually there's a couple people out front. Well, obviously, it's changed since that time period where now, obviously, in the book, it talks about how they wear these head lanterns that flash into the water, which make it a little bit easier, where they don't have to use the flaming torches anymore. So what this all revolves around is the conflict that comes up in 1983, 1984, where for a very long time, the treaty rights from 1837 and 1842 are not being acknowledged. Over that course of time, the decades that follow afterwards and the generations basically the state of Wisconsin starts to kind of limit what these indigenous people are capable of doing. They actually start to get to the point where they restrict the OGBW tribes from actually hunting and fishing off reservation lands. So when it first comes out, Wisconsin basically says to the Supreme Court saying that, like, hey, it's a state matter. We're going to handle it. We're going to do what we want to do. And eventually it makes its way to the Supreme Court. The tribal leaders actually bring it to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court basically says, like, 1983, like, you need to work this out within your states. Like, the treaty rights are still upheld from 1837 and 1842. They didn't go away. They didn't disappear. They're not null and void. They're still there. And it grants the tribes the right to fish and hunt off the reservation. And you can imagine during this time period in early 80s and late 80s, it's a different type or different kind of world. And obviously, a lot of the locals are really kind of upset with this. So, northern Wisconsin for a very long time was known for harvesting timber, iron ore, and other precious metals from that area. And eventually, over the years, those kind of faded away. And one of the biggest attractions to the area was actually sport, fishing and hunting. That drove a lot of the industry in the area. So the people who are non-indigenous were really kind of upset with how they started to allow the tribal people, Native Americans, to start to hunt and fish off reservation. And obviously, spearfishing to an outside person can seem very kind of off. And where they're taking 300-400, in some cases up to 1,200 fish in a night, a lot of the people in the area start to get concerned that, like, hey, wait a second. They're going to hurt our industry, which relies on people coming up from the city, like from Chicago, to come up to the area to, experience walleye fishing. And walleye fishing is a huge game sport for the area and attracts a lot of people. People pay lots of money to obviously go up there and to fish on these lakes. So when the spearfishing takes place, a lot of the non-indigenous people start to become very kind of concerned that, wait a second, these tribal people, the Native Americans, are coming in here, the Ojibwe tribes, and they are taking hundreds of fish. And of course, the people were upset and they didn't have the background knowledge and they didn't really realize that they were taking a very small percentage of the walleye population. Now, this brings into conflict. Obviously, the people on one hand, the non-indigenous people, want to stop the spearfishing. They think it is hurting the lakes. They think it is hurting the wildlife. They are thinking that eventually it's going to kind of eliminate the walleye population. And on the other hand, you have the Ojibwe tribes who are relying on this. It's not just sport for them. For the Ojibwe people, this is their way of life. This is actually a large food source for these tribes. And of course, non-indigenous people don't understand that. And the Ojibwe people, they're not only just trying to take care of their families and trying to feed their tribes, but they're also looking at a greater picture here, something that's much bigger than just trying to feed their families. What they're simply looking at is bringing back their treaties and actually acknowledging their treaties, which allows them to live this sovereign life, to live not relying on the government or anyone else, but to live their own life independently. And that's what's being threatened to the Ojibwe tribes up in Lake des Flambeaux and other areas throughout northern Wisconsin. So the conflict takes place in probably mid to late 80s, so 1986, all the way up to about 1991. So in 1986, permits are starting to be issued by the Department of Wildlife in northern Wisconsin, the Great Lakes Wildlife Management. They start to issue permits, which allows for the tribal people to be able to fish off reservation and be able to harvest a certain percentage of fish throughout the spring. They they fish throughout the springtime, and they have a certain amount of time, several weeks to do so. And these permits, they do allow the indigenous people, the Ojibwe, to hunt so much fish within a certain period of time. So what ends up coming about with this is obviously you have the non-indigenous people, the residents outside the area who are feeling threatened. And of course, people who are not really educated on what is going on or about the actual matter, they turn to become more ignorant. And that's a great kind of word that Larry Nestor kind of uses in one of his separate lectures that talks about this. He kind of refers to the people uh, that are protesting that they're being ignorant. So to kind of talk a little bit about the protests and what they looked like. So a lot of these spearfishers, these walleye warriors that they're called, would show up to these boat ramps in the springtime. They would bring their boats, they would bring all their gear with them. They would have their permits, and the Department of Conservation, would actually be there. The Department of Wildlife would actually kind of make sure that obviously everything is being followed out accordingly. And of course, the Chippewa people, the OGBE, were following all protocols. So the protesters and how they protest at the beginning is when they would literally show up to these boat ramps in the evening hours when these spear fishermen were showing up to conduct their sovereign right, their right that several generations before them, over hundreds of years, their great ancestors were able to practice. And for these Ojibwe tribe members that are practicing spearfishing, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to bring back their Indianness. They're trying to bring back at what was once taken from them and what has died off. And obviously, we have discussed throughout class about how the lives of Native Americans throughout the generations has changed and how people view them. And this is an opportunity for the Ojibwe tribe and other tribes in the area to kind of take back their Indianness and practice what their ancestors had done many years ago. So going back to the boat ramp, protesters would show up at these lakes. So certain lakes were allowed to be fished during the spring season. And this is part of the permit process that these Native Americans would obviously go collect their permits, and they were basically kind of told like what lakes that they could fish on, and what day they could be there, how much fish they could take. One of the requirements was that they would not necessarily capture, or not capture, but kill female walleye, mostly because during the spring season, the female walleye are obviously pregnant and they're obviously going to lay eggs, which is going to kind of add to the population of the lake with walleye. And that's where a lot of people, especially these non-Indigenous people, were really concerned that they were just saying like, oh, these savages are going out on the lake and they're just killing everything. They don't really care about like, the males and the females. They're just kind of going out there and they're kind of savagely killing, taking more than what they really need. When in reality, they weren't. The Ojibwe tribes or the Chippewa, they were very careful. They actually, I think the percentage that they said, according to the Department of Wildlife in northern Wisconsin, said that when they brought in their catch, there was only about literally 3 to 6% of the harvest had female walleye in it. And while this is all occurring, the protesters are at the boat ramp from the time that they take off to the time that they come back. And now kind of picture this. Northern Wisconsin, late 1980s, try and put in this kind of mindset, what's kind of going out there. Like you got these kind of people that, like I said, kind of ignorant in a sense. So these people are showing up at these boat ramps and they are literally harassing these fishermen with verbal assaults, racial language that's being thrown out there. There's some language I can't use. They're calling them, I'll say it. They were literally calling these Native Americans, they were calling them timber niggers, kind of give you an idea of what kind of racism these Native Americans, these spearfishers, were kind of facing. They were also getting rocks thrown at them. They were getting their tires slashed. It was awful, to the point where even there were sometimes even like gunshots that would kind of get thrown out there. So over the years, obviously this is a major concern with the Ojibwe people and their safety and practicing their sovereign right. So over the years, many anti-treaty leaders of these non-Indigenous people have tried to come up with ways going to the court system in northern Wisconsin, trying to find ways to block the Ojibwe tribes from actually being able to practice their sovereign right. And of course, during this time period, there is some corruption, and there's many times that it almost comes to the point where the OGBW are facing a point where they might actually be limited to fishing off reservation. But it's actually Judge Crabb that comes to the rescue. And right around 1990, she handled a case that basically kind of told the state of Wisconsin that these indigenous people and their treaties from 1837 to 1842, they had the right to practice spearfishing off reservation. Again, these treaties didn't go anywhere. They did not expire. So obviously at this point, it still continues with the protesters. So late 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, you see this giant buildup of hostility between protesters and between spearfishermen. Now, keep in mind, the spearfishermen, it really reminds me of like the civil rights movement down in southern states, like thinking about like Martin Luther King Jr. And the reason why I say that is because they practice nonviolence. At several powwows of the OGBW and the community centers that they gathered at to discuss these concerns of protesters and their violence and their racial slurs that they're throwing out, they constantly reminded the spearfishermen and the people to practice nonviolence. So eventually what starts to build over these years is when the spearfishermen would show up to these boat ramps, you would have one side of protesters and you would have one other side of supporters, tribal members. And excuse me. And it's really cool. In the later years, there's a large support that is going out there for non-Indigenous people, along with the Indigenous people who are trying to support these spearfishermen, but not just the spearfishermen, but to protect the sovereign right and treaties of the Indigenous people. And on the other side, you have the protesters who are growing in numbers as well. To some points where if you look up online, you'll actually see some of the protesters out there and how violent they are. I mean, they literally referred to these people in racial slurs, but also in one instance where they had like a fake mannequin of an Indian on a trident, because that's the best way I can kind of describe like what the spearfishermen are using. It's almost four prongs that would kind of be on a pole, and they would kind of shoot into the water to spear the fish. And they had a Native American head on this giant prong to kind of symbolize like, how they felt about the OGBW people who are spearfishing on these lakes. It's quite graphic to a point, and it even gets to a point where it talks about protesters holding signs basically say, spear a pregnant Indian woman and save 2 walleye. It blows my mind that people were thinking this way. And Larry Nesper goes around several times throughout the book interviewing other people. And if you watch one of his lectures online about the book, he describes that when he would go up to these protesters and ask them, like, do you know anything about treaty rights? Do you know anything about the indigenous ways of the OGBW tribe? And of course, the ignorant response is like, I don't need to know. It doesn't matter. And that's the type of people that these protesters were. In their mindset, they had this idea that they were doing the right thing, that they were protecting these lakes from these savages who were obviously destroying the wildlife, when in reality, they were not. They actually mentioned several times in the book that the spearfishermen, along with the tribes, actually formed several hatcheries to increase the population of the walleye. Because at the end of the day, the OGBW people, they're not going anywhere. They've been on these lands for over hundreds of years, even predating the United States of America. They do not want to ruin the wildlife. They live off of it. This is their way, and this is how they live. They don't want to destroy that. And of course, like I said before, the protesters are very ignorant in the sense where they don't take that into account. So one thing that does come up Larry Nesper mentioned several times is the unity that is formed with the Ojibwe tribes, and also they bring in other groups. American Indian Movement (AIM) is a huge support to this, and it actually all culminates around Butternut Lake, which is right around in the 1990s, 1991, where they gathered their largest support. The spearfishermen were going out to Butternut Lake that night, and in the book it mentions that they had over 1,500 supporters, largely non-indigenous, tribal members, people from all across the country that came up to support these spearfishermen and to obviously kind of counter protest all the protesters there who were very hostile. Now, this is a turning moment because this is where they really kind of show and kind of, I guess, kind of demonstrate their Indianness to the point where there's many powwows that take place after this that talk about Butternut Lake as a huge moment for the indigenous people, the Ojibwe tribes, and they count it as a success. And over the years, obviously, many court cases are brought into this. But there's one important thing that does come on up. There is tension that develops between different tribes of the Ojibwe. Not all of them are in supporting of the spearfishing. And what I mean by that is the state of Wisconsin at one point in the not late 80s, but early 90s, comes into play where they actually tried to kind of solve this dilemma of obviously spearfishing, practicing their sovereign right that was granted back to them from 1837 and 1842. And with this, they tried to basically kind of, a great way to kind of explain this is they tried to assimilate the Indians. They actually offer up large sums of money. I believe it's around like $50 million over 10 years to these tribes to kind of almost renegotiate these treaties and try and basically change it around where people would not be allowed to go spearfishing anymore and kind of limit their sovereign right. And it becomes a dilemma within these tribes. Some tribes actually lean towards taking this offer and signing the legislation that would obviously kind of put a limit or an end to some spearfishing that is taking place off reservation. And Tom Molson, who is a leader for the spearfishermen, he's considered a tribal war chief. He is mentioned several times throughout the book in the sense that he is leading this charge and this pride in spearfishing and what it means to the Ojibwe people and how important it is. And obviously he fronts not signing this bill, not signing this legislation that basically would sell out a lot of these tribes. This made me think of the last lecture I did, which was Peace, Power, and Righteousness, and how it mentioned a lot of tribal leaders who basically kind of sold out their people and they kind of assimilated with local governments or state governments by signing, bills that would give obviously more money and wealth to the tribes, but it takes away their sovereign right. And when we circle all the way back around to this is what the whole account of the book really is. It's not necessarily like, obviously, spearfishing is a very important part to the Ojibwe people, and it's how they survive. But it's also their Indianness. It's their connection to their ancestors. It's what allows them to be who they are as a tribe and as a group of people. It actually mentions in here Larry Nesper discussing with some of the tribal leaders who talk about the seventh prophecy, which talks about the revitalization of these tribes in their ways of the past. And the prophecies before this talk about how they would experience, obviously, a fair-skinned people and how the tribes would experience very difficult times and how they would have to kind of struggle and survive. But the seventh prophecy talks about how this revival of these indigenous people, the Ojibwe tribes, and how they would find success moving forward. So when it circles back around to this, the overall theme of the book is, obviously these spear fishermen from the Ojibwe tribes practicing their sovereign right. But again, it goes to what these people are trying to hold dear to. And that essentially is their Indianness, which allows them to be who they are as a people and practices their own sovereign rights. If you do get a chance, Larry Nesper has a great video. It's about 45 minutes long that you can find on YouTube. All you gotta do is just type in the Walleye War, and you'll see his documentary there. But he does a great job going through the book and explaining more important details. He also goes into discussion about deer hunting rights that occur here, and he does mention it in the book as well. But the Walleye War is a fantastic read that really goes into detail explaining how in the late 80s, this is how these tribes had to kind of fight for their sovereign right, for treaties that had been nulled and that were still relevant, that were being nulled and void by the people of today. And if you get a chance, there's actually an interview with Tom Molson that goes into more detail about these accounts. But looking through this book, one of the major areas that creates a huge turn for the spear fishermen and gaining more support was bringing in AIM, which is the American Indian movement. This gained a lot of support for them, which actually helped them bring their case all the way to the Supreme Court level, because it does get challenged several times. And obviously it gets withheld that these treaty rights belong to the indigenous people. Throughout this, it does a great job of giving the account of the powwows that take place. One thing I do want to kind of go back to that I'm just thinking about now, I apologize, I'm kind of bouncing around about, is going back to talk about the Ojibwe tribes and some of the conflicts that do occur between it. So there's 11 different Ojibwe tribes, and I told you how that obviously they were going to kind of come up with this legislation that was going to sell out, obviously giving away their sovereign right in terms of for money. So going back to that, there is several times throughout the book where Larry Nesper goes into accounts and details sitting through these powwows in the community centers and actually discusses and talks about how a lot of these tribal members had lots of conflict, to the point where these tribal leaders, a lot of times when certain questions were brought up, they would actually just leave. And some of these tribal leaders are questioned throughout the book whether they're actually supporting the indigenous people or they're more supporting the local government. But it's a very close vote. It happens in 1991 where they vote on this legislation that they barely won, but they protected their rights and actually turned down the $50 million along with other government supports that would go into these tribes. And that was really important to read for me, because that showed me that these people were really protecting their sovereign right, that they were literally wanting to practice their Indianness, that they did not want to give that up. And it's a very important thing to kind of look to. So one thing that does come out of this to help ease the conflict in the early 90s, there's still protesters. They do die down in numbers, and eventually supporters kind of fade away as well. But they took the educational approach. And what I mean by that is in the state of Wisconsin now, they actually educate a lot of the elementary schools all the way up through high school about the Ojibwe tribe and their way and their history and their ancestry, to help people gain a better idea of why these people spearfish, why these people practice these rites. And with this, it does help people get a better understanding of obviously what's going on, because I think one of the biggest things that comes out of this book, it just shows the ignorance of the protesters not having a background, but also the racial tension that exists. And it's something that I'm sure is seen throughout other books and throughout other tribes, and probably is still seen throughout different areas of our country today. But it really brought forward uh, the racial hatred that these people had for the Ojibwe people who were just simply just trying to practice their sovereign right of spearfishing. Uh, if you do have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to ask and leave them with us. It's a book that I strongly recommend. It does a great job of kind of laying out the conflict. It gives it to you in an account of Larry Nesper being there, interviewing people, uh, documenting what's going on between protesters and the tribes that are involved with this and the leaders of these tribes. And he does a great job of kind of bringing to light what the major picture really is with this, and going back to like sovereign rights and allowing these tribes to practice their actual Indianness and actually follow their roots of who they are from several generations ago. Thank you for watching. I hope to hear from you all, and I hope you enjoy. Take care. Bye.